There's a particular kind of violence that comes wrapped in silk and hidden behind mahogany doors. The kind that leaves no bruises on the surface but destroys lives with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. Before we go deeper, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more old money stories. In the autumn of 1897, a nondescript brownstone on East 10th Street in Manhattan held a secret that would soon unravel one of the most disturbing networks in Gilded Age America. Inside these walls, babies disappeared with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine, and the city's wealthiest families paid handsomely for the service. This is the story of how America's elite turned human life into a commodity, how respectability was purchased with blood money, and how the children of scandal became the currency of New York's darkest economy. The woman at the center of this particular horror was Sarah Edwards Hamilton, though she went by at least 7 different names. Depending on which neighborhood she was operating in, to the wealthy families of Fifth Avenue, she was Mrs. Hamilton, the discreet midwife who could solve delicate problems. To the desperate young women who knocked on her door, she was salvation. To the infants who passed through her care, she was often the last face they would ever see. But Hamilton was just one thread in a tapestry of exploitation that stretched across every major American city. From New York to San Francisco, from Boston to New Orleans, wherever wealth concentrated, wherever reputation mattered more than morality, the baby farms flourished like poisonous flowers in carefully tended gardens. The Gilded Age earned its name from Mark Twain, who understood that beneath the golden surface lay rot and corruption. Nowhere was this more true than in the treatment of unwanted children. The babies born to servants seduced by their employers, the infants resulting from affairs that could destroy dynasties, the children whose very existence threatened carefully constructed facades of respectability. These weren't the poor selling their children. Though poverty played its role, these were stories of the wealthy disposing of their secrets, of society matrons arranging for their daughters' indiscretions to vanish, of prominent men ensuring their mistresses' pregnancies would never complicate their marriages, of entire families conspiring to erase evidence of scandal before it could stain their names in the social register. The economics were simple and brutal. A wealthy family might pay between $500 and $2,000 to make a problem disappear. In today's currency, that's roughly $15,000 to $60,000 per child. Hamilton and her contemporaries earned more in a single transaction than most workers made in 5 years. What they did with those children would shock even the most cynical observer, but to understand how this system evolved, how it became normalized among America's elite, we must first understand the world that created it. This was an era when reputation wasn't just important, it was everything. A whisper of scandal could close every door, end every prospect, destroy generations of carefully accumulated social capital. Divorce was nearly impossible. Birth control was illegal under the Comstock laws, and abortion, while practiced, carried enormous risk. So the wealthy did what the wealthy have always done. They found a way to make their problems disappear, and they paid professionals to ensure those problems disappeared. The baby farms were their solution, and business was very, very good. Sarah Hamilton's operation represented the evolution of a system that had been perfecting itself for decades. By the 1890s, the baby farm industry had become sophisticated, organized, and terrifyingly efficient. She opened her establishment on East 10th Street in 1893, positioning herself in a neighborhood that straddled 2 worlds, close enough to wealth to be convenient, far enough from prying eyes to maintain discretion. The brownstone itself was unremarkable, exactly the kind of building where secrets could be kept. Hamilton advertised in carefully coded language. Her notices appeared in respectable newspapers under the heading, "Private Lying in Hospital." The wealthy understood the code immediately. Lying in hospitals were where women gave birth, but a private one. That was where you sent a daughter who needed to disappear for 9 months, or a mistress whose condition was becoming inconvenient. The services Hamilton offered came in tiers, like any other business catering to different levels of wealth and desperation. For $2,000, the premium package, a pregnant young woman would be secretly housed for the duration of her confinement, given adequate food and medical care, delivered of her child by Hamilton herself, and then returned home with her secret intact. The infant would be placed with a family, Hamilton promised, though she never specified which family or where. For $1,000, the standard package, the pregnant woman would be housed, only for the final month, delivered and sent home within days. Again, the child would be placed, a word that did enormous work in these transactions, suggesting care and consideration when it often meant something far more sinister. For $500, the economy option, Hamilton would simply take the newborn off your hands. No questions asked, no paperwork, no trail leading back to your door. This was the option for servants impregnated by their employers, for working mistresses of wealthy men, for anyone whose child was a problem that needed immediate solution. But Hamilton offered something else, something that reveals the true depth of this black market's integration into elite society. She would facilitate fake pregnancies. Here's how it worked, and it happened far more often than history admits. A wealthy couple, unable to conceive or perhaps harboring secrets about the husband's fertility, would approach Hamilton. The wife would begin wearing padding, gradually increasing her apparent size over 9 months. She would withdraw from society, claiming delicate health, exactly as pregnant women of her class were expected to do. Meanwhile, Hamilton would identify a pregnant woman of appropriate coloring and features, someone whose child could plausibly pass as the couple's biological offspring. Timing was everything. The real mother's delivery date had to align with the fake mother's supposed due date. When the child was born, Hamilton would bring the infant to the wealthy couple's home, usually at night. The society wife would take to her bed, screaming appropriately for the servants to hear, and Hamilton would deliver the baby she'd brought with her. Within hours, the couple would have a legitimate heir, complete with birth certificate signed by Hamilton as attending midwife. The biological mother, if she survived childbirth, would be paid a fraction of what the adopting family had spent, often as little as $50, and sent on her way, usually with threats about what would happen if she ever tried to reclaim her child. This wasn't adoption in any legal or ethical sense. This was human trafficking dressed in the language of charity. The New York Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children estimated that by 1895, over 300 such operations existed in New York City alone. Hamilton's establishment was neither the largest nor the worst. It was simply the one that would eventually be exposed, becoming the scandal that would finally force society to confront what it had been paying for all along. But Hamilton had competition, and some of her competitors made her operation look almost humane by comparison. In Brooklyn, Lena Steele ran what she called the Children's Home, a 3-story house that neighbors described as eerily quiet despite supposedly housing dozens of infants. Steele's prices were lower than Hamilton's, attracting a different clientele, mostly working-class families dealing with illegitimate births. What Steele did with the children she accepted has never been fully documented, but when police finally raided her establishment in 1899, they found something that would haunt investigators for the rest of their lives. In the basement, carefully wrapped in newspaper and stored in wooden crates, were the remains of 47 infants. To understand the scale of the baby farm industry, you have to understand the economics of infant mortality in the Gilded Age, and how those statistics could hide almost anything. In 1890, infant mortality rates in major American cities hovered around 30%, meaning 3 out of every 10 babies born alive would die before their first birthday. In poor neighborhoods, that number could reach 50%. These were deaths from disease, malnutrition, unsanitary conditions, all tragic but statistically expected, which meant that a few dozen extra dead babies in a neighborhood wouldn't raise eyebrows, wouldn't trigger investigations, wouldn't threaten the smooth operation of establishments like Hamilton's. The baby farmers understood this perfectly. They operated in the shadows cast by legitimate tragedy. When a wealthy family paid Hamilton to place their grandchild, they rarely asked where. Most didn't want to know. They wanted the problem solved, permanently and completely, and Hamilton delivered exactly that. Some children were genuinely adopted, placed with families who wanted them, and would raise them. These were usually the infants who met certain criteria: healthy, white, with no obvious defects. And even then, the adoptions were often accomplished through forged documents and false identities. But many others simply disappeared into a system designed for their disposal. The most common method was benign neglect. Hamilton would accept payment for a child's care, then provide minimal food and no medical attention. In the crowded, unsanitary conditions of her brownstone, disease spread rapidly. Infants weakened by hunger died from infections that proper care could have prevented. When they died, and they died often, Hamilton would register the death with a sympathetic doctor who asked no questions. The death certificate would list natural causes: cholera or pneumonia or any of the dozen illnesses that killed babies in that era. Then the small body would be disposed of, buried in potter's fields under false names or no names at all. This was murder by neglect, profitable and nearly impossible to prosecute. But some baby farmers went further, impatient with the slowness of natural death or worried about the costs of feeding even inadequately maintained infants. Laudanum, an opium tincture sold legally in any pharmacy, was the preferred tool. A few drops in milk would quiet a crying baby. A few drops more would ensure that baby never cried again. Overdose deaths looked like natural infant death, especially in an era before toxicology testing became standard. Smothering was another method, quick and leaving minimal evidence in an age when sudden infant death syndrome wasn't understood. When babies died mysteriously in their sleep all the time, who could prove it wasn't natural? The most disturbing cases involved outright sale of infants to medical schools for anatomical study. New York's medical colleges paid between $10 and $25 for infant cadavers. No questions asked about provenance. Baby farmers with the right connections could make a tidy profit from children whose deaths they'd arranged. Historian Linda Gordon's research into this period uncovered correspondence between a baby farmer named Margaret Williams and a medical school administrator. Williams offered a steady supply of specimens. The administrator's response was brief: "Your terms are acceptable. Discretion is essential." The babies who survived long enough to be noticed by neighbors or authorities were sometimes recovered, but their fates were often no better. In 1896, police raided a baby farm in Chicago and found 23 infants in a single room. Most were severely malnourished. Several had untreated infections. 2 died during transport to the hospital. The woman running the operation, Mrs. Frances Norcross, had been paid for the children's care. She was charged with manslaughter but convicted only of child neglect. She served 18 months. The families who'd paid her were never identified. They had covered their tracks too well, and honestly, authorities weren't particularly interested in pursuing them. These were respectable people. The thinking went, caught up in unfortunate circumstances. But Sarah Hamilton's operation, which had run smoothly for 4 years, was about to face its reckoning. And the cause would be something she couldn't control: a guilty conscience and a grieving mother who refused to let her child be forgotten. Mary Kate Murphy was 19 years old when she became pregnant in the spring of 1897. The father was Jonathan Ashford, third son of the Ashford manufacturing family. Worth an estimated $12 million, Jonathan had no intention of marrying his family's Irish housemaid. His parents had even less intention of allowing such a scandal to unfold. When Mary's condition became undeniable, Jonathan's mother, Eleanor Ashford, took charge. Eleanor was exactly the kind of woman who knew about places like Sarah Hamilton's establishment. These things were discussed quietly among society ladies. Whispered recommendations passed between friends facing similar difficulties. Eleanor paid Hamilton $1,500. The arrangement was simple. Mary would be housed at the brownstone for the final 6 weeks of her pregnancy, delivered by Hamilton, and then returned to employment. Not with the Ashfords, obviously, but with another family in Philadelphia, far enough away to avoid awkward encounters. The baby, Eleanor was assured, would be placed with a good Christian family somewhere in the countryside where he would be raised properly. Mary arrived at the brownstone in October 1897. She was one of 4 pregnant women being housed there simultaneously. The others, she never really knew. Hamilton kept them separated, claiming privacy but really preventing them from comparing stories or forming alliances. The conditions were better than Mary had feared. She had her own small room, adequate food. Hamilton even allowed her to sit in a small parlor during the day, but something about the place felt wrong. There were sounds in the night, soft crying that wasn't from the other pregnant women, sounds that stopped abruptly. Mary gave birth on November 7th, a boy. She held him for perhaps 20 minutes before Hamilton took him, saying he needed to be cleaned and examined. Mary never saw her son again. Hamilton told her the baby had been placed the very next day. "Such a fine, healthy boy," she'd said. The family was thrilled, but when Mary asked where Hamilton's face had hardened, that wasn't part of their arrangement, she said. Too much knowledge could lead to complications. Mary returned to the Ashford household briefly, only long enough to collect her final wages and the $50 Eleanor had promised as settling up money. Then she was sent to Philadelphia. For 3 months, Mary tried to move on, but she couldn't stop thinking about her son. In February 1898, she made a decision that would change everything. She went to the police. The detective she spoke with was Michael Donahue, an Irish cop who'd grown up in the same neighborhood as Mary. He listened to her story with increasing alarm. He'd heard whispers about baby farms. Every cop had, but they were notoriously difficult to prosecute. The wealthy families involved had no interest in testifying. The women who used them were terrified of exposure, and the babies themselves were usually long gone. But Donahue decided to investigate. He started watching Hamilton's brownstone. What he observed over the next 2 weeks convinced him something criminal was happening. Women arrived visibly pregnant, left days or weeks later without babies. Yet, the brownstone never seemed to house many infants. Where were all the children going? On March 3, 1898, Donahue and 4 other officers raided the establishment. What they found was both less and more than they expected. There were only 3 infants in the building, all severely underweight, all showing signs of neglect. But there were records. Hamilton, it turned out, kept meticulous books, perhaps for her own protection. Perhaps out of simple business habit, those ledgers documented over 200 transactions in just 4 years. Names, dates, amounts paid, and in some cases, notes about what happened to the children. The entries were coded, but not particularly difficult to decipher. P meant placed with a family, D meant died, S meant sold, likely to medical schools. Of the 212 children documented in Hamilton's ledgers, 37 were marked P, 14 were marked S, and 161 were marked D. 161 dead babies in 4 years. That's one child every 9 days. The 3 infants found during the raid were immediately taken to Bellevue Hospital. 2 survived, 1 did not. Hamilton was arrested and charged with murder. But proving murder would be nearly impossible. Infant mortality was so high that any decent lawyer could argue these were natural deaths, and Hamilton had been careful. She'd had doctors sign death certificates. She'd followed the letter of the law in terms of reporting deaths. What would ultimately convict her wasn't the dead babies. It was the ledger entries, showing she'd accepted payment for care she never provided, and more damningly, the testimony of Dr. Nathan Silver. Dr. Silver had been one of Hamilton's regular physicians, signing death certificates and asking no questions. But when faced with prosecution himself, he testified that Hamilton had once told him she gave the sickest infants extra medicine to speed their passing, that laudanum was cheaper than milk. The trial began in August 1898, and it became a sensation. Not because New York cared about dead babies were commonplace, but because the ledgers threatened to expose dozens of wealthy families. Hamilton's lawyer tried to use this as leverage. He implied that if Hamilton went down, she'd take others with her. Prominent names would be revealed. Reputations would be destroyed. It was a miscalculation. The families involved were far more powerful than Hamilton, and they moved quickly to protect themselves. The most remarkable aspect of the Hamilton trial wasn't what was revealed, it was what was carefully, deliberately suppressed. Within days of the raid, before Hamilton had even been formally charged, mysterious things began happening to the evidence. The ledgers, which should have been the prosecution's most powerful tool, went missing for 3 days. When they reappeared, several pages had been removed. The missing pages, according to a clerk who'd seen them, contained the most detailed entries, the ones that included full names rather than just initials. Detective Donahue fought to keep the case moving forward, but he found himself increasingly blocked. Witnesses who'd agreed to testify suddenly refused. The judge assigned to the case, Martin Hendricks, was known for his connections to New York's elite. And then there was the matter of the Ashford family. Mary Murphy's testimony should have brought them into the case directly. She could identify them, had worked for them, had been paid by them to use Hamilton's services. But Eleanor Ashford was never called to testify, never questioned, never even officially acknowledged as being connected to the case. How was this possible? How do you build a criminal case around a victim while ignoring the people who paid for the crime? The answer reveals how power operated in Gilded Age America, and honestly, how it still operates today. The Ashfords had connections. Jonathan's father, Martin Ashford, sat on the boards of 3 banks. He was personal friends with the mayor. He'd donated substantially to the campaign of New York's governor. 2 days after Mary Murphy gave her initial statement to police, she was visited by a lawyer named Charles Worthington. Worthington represented the Ashford family, and he had a proposal. The Ashfords would pay Mary $5,000, an extraordinary sum, in exchange for her agreement to certain conditions. She would testify only about her own experience. She would not mention the Ashford name in court, if asked directly. She would claim she couldn't remember which family she'd worked for. Mary, who was surviving on wages of $6 a week, agreed. She testified at Hamilton's trial, but her testimony was vague on crucial details. Who had paid for her stay at the brownstone? Who was the father of her child? Who had arranged the transaction? This pattern repeated with other witnesses. Women would come forward, tell their stories, but somehow never quite name the families involved. The prosecutor, District Attorney James Wheeler, could have pushed harder. He had subpoena power. He could have compelled testimony, but Wheeler was a political creature. He understood that some battles weren't worth fighting, especially when the people you'd be fighting against funded political campaigns and sat on the boards that governed your career advancement. So the trial focused narrowly on Sarah Hamilton's actions, divorced from the context that made those actions possible. She wasn't presented as part of a system. She was portrayed as an individual monster, an aberration. Dr. Silver's testimony was damning. He described Hamilton's casual attitude toward infant death, her calculation that it was more profitable to let sick babies die than to spend money treating them. The prosecution brought in 3 mothers who'd used Hamilton's services and later tried to find their children. All 3 testified that Hamilton had told them their babies were dead, but none of them had received death certificates. None had been told where their children were buried. One woman, Catherine O'Brien, described arriving at the brownstone to collect her daughter. She'd paid for 3 months of care and planned to take the baby back after that time. Hamilton told her the child had died 2 weeks earlier of pneumonia. But when Catherine demanded to see the grave, Hamilton became hostile. There was no grave, she said. The baby had been cremated. This was almost certainly a lie. Cremation was extremely rare in 1898, especially for infants, and it required documentation that Hamilton couldn't produce. Catherine believed, and the jury seemed to agree, that her daughter had been sold either to another family or to a medical school. The defense tried to argue that Hamilton was providing a necessary service, that without women like her, desperate mothers would resort to more dangerous measures: infanticide, abandonment, back-alley abortions. This argument had some merit, and it exposed the hypocrisy at the heart of the system. Society created the conditions that made baby farms necessary: laws against birth control and abortion, stigma against unwed mothers, economic structures that gave women few options, and then society acted shocked when people like Hamilton emerged to profit from those conditions. But the defense couldn't overcome the evidence of deliberate neglect. The testimony about laudanum overdoses, the ledger showing children marked as dead days or weeks after being placed in Hamilton's care. On November 12, 1898, after 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict: guilty of murder in the second degree. Hamilton was sentenced to 20 years in Auburn State Prison. She would serve 13 before dying of tuberculosis in 1911. She never revealed the names in her ledgers. She went to prison knowing that her silence protected her. Had she talked? Had she named the families who'd paid her? She would have faced far worse than prison. Accidents happened, even in secure facilities. Her conviction was celebrated in the press as a victory for justice, as proof that even the powerful couldn't escape accountability. But this was theater. Hamilton was a scapegoat, useful precisely because punishing her allowed everyone else to avoid examination. Not a single wealthy family was ever charged. Not a single society matron was called to testify about arranging for her daughter's indiscretion to be handled. Not a single prominent man faced questions about the mistress whose pregnancy he'd paid Hamilton to resolve. The system that created baby farms remained intact because the system was functioning exactly as designed. Suffocation, her motive was purely economic. She could accept payment for care, kill the child immediately, and then accept another payment for another child, one building, minimal expenses. Maximum profit. Steele was convicted and hanged in 1900. One of the rare cases where someone in this industry faced capital punishment, but again, the families who'd paid her were never pursued. The closest America came to actually reforming the system was the establishment of the Children's Bureau in 1912. This federal agency was tasked with investigating child welfare, including the practices of private adoption agencies and boarding houses for infants. But the Bureau was chronically underfunded and had limited enforcement power. It could investigate and report, but actually prosecuting operators required local authorities to cooperate, and local authorities were often reluctant to pursue cases that might embarrass prominent families. What finally began to change the industry wasn't legal reform. It was technological and social change. Birth control became more accessible, despite the Comstock laws. By the 1920s, most middle-class women had some access to contraception. Abortion, while illegal, became safer as medical knowledge improved. Women with means could find discreet doctors willing to perform the procedure. Adoption itself became more regulated. States began requiring licensing for adoption agencies, implementing home studies for prospective parents, creating paper trails that made trafficking more difficult. But perhaps most importantly, the stigma around unwed motherhood began to slowly shift. Very slowly, but the absolute social death that an illegitimate child represented in 1890 was somewhat less absolute by 1930. Women's rights to own property, to divorce, to have some legal identity separate from their husbands or fathers. These incremental changes gave women slightly more power, slightly more options. The baby farms didn't disappear completely. Even today, illegal adoption markets exist. Child trafficking remains a global industry. But the specific phenomenon of wealthy families paying for infant disposal declined as other solutions became available. Still, the legacy of the Gilded Age baby farms haunts us, because it reveals something uncomfortable about how power operates. These weren't isolated criminals preying on the helpless, though that's how they were portrayed. These were service providers meeting demand from society's most powerful members. The wealthy families who used baby farms weren't punished because the people who would have punished them, judges, prosecutors, politicians, legislators, were either part of the same social class or dependent on that class for their own power. This is how systems of exploitation persist, not through the cruelty of individual monsters, but through the collective decision of powerful people to protect their interests. Sarah Hamilton murdered babies for profit, yes, but she couldn't have done it without the families who paid her. The doctors who looked the other way, the officials who declined to investigate, the legal system that punished her while protecting her clients. Her brownstone on East 10th Street is gone now. Demolished in 1923 to make way for an apartment building, there's no plaque marking what happened there. No memorial to the children who died, the Ashford family, whose payment to Hamilton started Mary Murphy on her journey toward justice, remained prominent in New York society for another generation. Jonathan Ashford eventually married a woman from another manufacturing family. They had 4 children, legitimate ones who inherited the family fortune. Whether Jonathan ever thought about the son he fathered with Mary Murphy, the son who vanished into Hamilton's brownstone, we can't know. Probably not. Probably he'd been taught that some things were better forgotten, that the past was past, that what happened to inconvenient children wasn't really his responsibility. Mary Murphy lived until 1947. She never married, never had other children. Near the end of her life, she gave an interview to a social worker researching the baby farm era. In that interview, Mary said something that cuts to the heart of this entire dark chapter. They told me I was lucky that Mrs. Hamilton would solve my problem, that I could go back to my life as if nothing had happened. But nothing did happen for me afterward. I lived the rest of my life wondering what happened to him, wondering if he suffered, wondering if he ever wondered about me. That's what the baby farms really were. A machine for converting human lives into convenient forgetting, for the wealthy who paid, for the operators who profited, and for the society that looked away. The babies didn't forget because the babies died. And the dead don't forget anything. They just stop being counted in the end. Perhaps that's the most horrifying truth about the Gilded Age baby farm industry. It showed us that, in the calculus of power, some lives simply don't register. Some deaths don't matter enough to interrupt business. And when we ask ourselves how such things could happen, how a civilized society could tolerate such systematic destruction of infant life, we might remember that it happened because the people with power to stop it benefited from it continuing. The brownstone is gone, the babies are gone, the operators are dead. But the willingness of power to dispose of inconvenient lives, that legacy remains. Waiting for the next time society decides some lives aren't worth the trouble of protecting, that's the lesson of the baby farms. Not that evil people do evil things, but that systems of power will sacrifice anyone, even helpless infants, to maintain themselves. And that should terrify us far more than any individual